The map is small. The consequences are not. A chain of islands scattered like breadcrumbs across blue water. Sunlit harbors, calm horizons. And beneath that calm, a question few people were ever invited to ask. Who truly controls the gates where the world's goods enter and leave the Caribbean? Because ports are not just places where ships dock. They are arteries. Whoever grips them controls flow, leverage, and timing. History has proven this again and again. Not with speeches, but with shortages. Not with flags, but with delays. For decades, Jamaica's ports were described as infrastructure. Neutral, technical, boring. Yet infrastructure has always been where power hides when it does not wish to be seen. Roads decide where wealth travels. Cables decide who speaks. Ports decide who waits. And waiting, as entire regions have learned, is rarely accidental. Here is the raw fact most people never hear spoken aloud. Some of the most strategically located ports in the Caribbean sit at the intersection of global trade routes linking the Americas, Africa, Europe, and Asia. Whoever influences them does not need to shout. They simply need patience. This is where the story begins. Not with a confrontation, but with silence. For years, contracts were signed quietly, memorandums framed as partnerships, investments described as development. Cranes rose, container yards expanded, and ordinary Jamaicans were told the same reassuring phrase their grandparents had heard before. This will bring jobs, growth, opportunity. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it brings dependency dressed as progress. Before we go further, take a moment. If you believe the world is more complex than headlines allow, if you believe power is often exercised without noise, consider staying with this channel. Subscribing is not about agreement. It is about refusing to look away when uncomfortable questions emerge. Because the uncomfortable question is this: when strategic infrastructure changes hands, who gains sovereignty and who quietly loses it? The people most affected rarely sit at negotiating tables. Dock workers feel it first. Small exporters feel it next. Then prices shift, access tightens, and decisions that once felt local begin to answer to distant interests. This is not a story about villains or heroes. It is about patterns, and patterns repeat when they are ignored. Across the global south, similar arrangements have unfolded under different names, always framed as cooperation, always backed by capital, always explained as inevitable in a globalized economy. Yet inevitability is often the language of those who benefit from inertia. Jamaica, like many island nations, lives with a paradox. It is geographically small, but strategically enormous. Its location makes it a natural gateway. Its economy makes it vulnerable to pressure. Its people inherit the consequences of choices made generations earlier. And then, unexpectedly, a voice from far outside the Caribbean breaks the rhythm. Not from Washington, not from London, but from West Africa. When Ibrahim Traoré spoke, it was not a declaration. It was an observation. Calm, measured, almost clinical. Yet it landed with unusual weight, because it did something rare. It connected dots most leaders prefer to keep separate. He did not name enemies. He did not issue threats. He raised a mirror. What happens when ports cease to belong fully to the nations that host them? What happens when strategic assets are embedded in global games far larger than the public narratives surrounding them? For many listeners, this felt like an Ibrahim Traoré moment, not because of volume, but because of timing. A reminder that sovereignty does not vanish overnight. It erodes quietly, clause by clause. In Jamaica, Reactions were mixed. Some dismissed the comments as external noise. Others felt an old discomfort resurface, a sense that history was echoing again, only with new actors and new language, because the Caribbean knows this story intimately. Sugar, shipping lanes, naval bases, tourism corridors. The island has long been a prize precisely because it is peaceful on the surface. What made this moment different was not accusation, but alignment. Across Africa, the Caribbean, and beyond, people recognized the pattern instantly. Infrastructure first, influence later, silence throughout. The global reaction did not explode. It rippled. Analysts debated, commentators hedged, officials reassured. Yet something subtle shifted. A question once confined to academic papers entered everyday conversations. If partnerships are truly equal, why is transparency so rare? If development is the goal, why do local voices feel excluded? If control is not changing, why does decision-making feel increasingly distant? These questions do not accuse, they examine. And examination is dangerous to any system built on passive acceptance. This is where the road forks. One path leads to comfort, the other to clarity. Comfort says nothing is wrong, because acknowledging risk requires responsibility. Clarity demands attention, patience, and the courage to sit with uncertainty. The Caribbean now stands at that fork, whether it chooses to acknowledge it or not. And the next chapter of this story is not about Jamaica alone. It is about how global power is shifting, quietly, through contracts rather than conflicts. Because once you see how the game is played, you start noticing the same moves elsewhere. And that is where the real pressure begins. The board was already set long before anyone noticed the pieces moving. To understand why Jamaica's ports matter, you have to step back from the island itself and look at the wider map. Not the political map, but the logistical one. Shipping lanes curve like veins across oceans. The busiest routes do not belong to the largest countries, but to the narrow passages between them. Choke points, gateways, shortcuts that shave days off journeys and millions off costs. The Caribbean sits astride several of these routes. Vessels moving between the Atlantic and the Americas pass through its waters daily. Goods bound for North America, South America, Europe, and Africa cross paths here. Ports in this region are not peripheral, they are central. This is why investment in port infrastructure is never just about efficiency, it is about presence. Modern ports are complex systems. They combine cranes, data networks, logistics software, customs processing, security protocols, and long-term concessions. Control does not require ownership of land alone. It can be exercised through management rights, technology platforms, financing structures, and contract duration. On paper, these arrangements look technical. In practice, they shape who decides what moves, when it moves, and under whose rules. In Jamaica, successive upgrades were presented as necessary steps to remain competitive. Global trade is unforgiving, officials argued. Fall behind, and ships reroute. Jobs disappear. Revenues shrink. The logic was sound. The urgency real. What received less attention was the asymmetry built into many such agreements. Capital-rich partners bring financing, expertise, and timelines. Host nations bring geography, labor, and long-term exposure. One side can exit. The other cannot relocate its coastline. This is where costs begin to accumulate quietly. When management systems are external, data flows outward. When financing is external, repayment schedules shape domestic priorities. When strategic assets are tied to long concessions, future governments inherit constraints they did not negotiate. None of this is inherently malicious, but none of it is neutral either. Supporters of these partnerships point to visible benefits: larger vessels accommodated, faster turnaround times, increased throughput, jobs during construction, training programs, regional competitiveness. Critics point to less visible effects: reduced policy flexibility, dependence on foreign maintenance and technology, limited transparency, difficulty renegotiating terms once infrastructure is embedded. Both can be true at the same time. This is why the debate cannot be reduced to slogans. It lives in details most citizens never see. At roughly this point in the conversation, something important needs to be said. If this analysis resonates with you, if you believe these discussions deserve more than sound bites, let us know you are here. A simple thank you in the comments tells the algorithm there is an audience willing to think, not just react. Because reactions alone do not change systems. Understanding does. The broader consequence is regional. When one port shifts its operational center of gravity, neighboring ports feel the pressure. Shipping alliances recalibrate. Smaller economies compete for the same traffic with fewer bargaining tools. A race begins, not always toward better outcomes, but toward survival within imposed parameters. This is how strategic influence scales without headlines. And this is where the Caribbean's historical memory matters. The region has lived through cycles of external control before. Different empires, different justifications, similar outcomes. Each time, infrastructure preceded governance, trade preceded policy, dependency preceded intervention. What makes the current era distinct is speed. Decisions that once unfolded over decades now lock in within a few years. Technology accelerates integration. Contracts extend beyond electoral cycles. By the time public debate begins, the framework is already operational. This is why the observation from West Africa resonated. It was not about Jamaica alone. It was about a pattern emerging simultaneously across continents. Ports in Africa, railways in Asia, digital infrastructure everywhere, each framed as development, each carrying strategic weight. The question is not whether nations should engage globally. They must. The question is how to do so without surrendering the ability to decide their own future. Silence in this context is not neutrality. It is acquiescence. And while official statements remained calm, the undercurrent was unmistakable. Analysts began revisiting old agreements. Civil society groups asked for clarity. Citizens, long excluded from such conversations, started asking why these decisions felt irreversible. Because once infrastructure becomes a lever, it rarely stays idle. The real issue now is not what has already been signed, but what comes next. Whether transparency increases or recedes, whether public oversight expands or contracts, whether partnerships evolve into genuine cooperation or drift toward quiet control. The game is not over, but the opening moves have been made, and in the next part of this story, pressure intensifies. Responses harden, choices narrow, because when questions move from the margins to the center, every actor is forced to reveal where they stand. Pressure rarely announces itself, it accumulates. Once the questions entered the open, responses began to harden. Not loudly, not all at once, but through tone, timing, and what was left unsaid. Statements emphasized continuity. Officials reassured markets. Partners reiterated commitments. The language of stability filled the air. Yet stability is often invoked precisely when change is underway. At this stage, the conversation stopped being abstract. It became operational. What data systems were integrated? Who maintained them? What contingencies existed if agreements were tested by geopolitical strain? These were not theoretical concerns. They were practical, immediate, and deeply consequential. The pivot came when the issue was no longer framed as Jamaica's internal development choice, but as part of a wider realignment in global logistics. Suddenly, the island's ports were discussed alongside facilities in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, not as isolated investments, but as nodes within a network. That reframing mattered, because networks behave differently from individual assets. Control in a network does not require domination everywhere. It requires leverage at key points: timing, interoperability, standards, data visibility. These are the quiet instruments of influence in the modern era. This is why the moment resonated beyond policy circles. For many observers, this felt like another Ibrahim Traoré moment, not because it escalated tensions, but because it articulated a reality others had skirted around. That global engagement, without strategic guardrails, can transform partners into passengers. Reactions followed predictable lines. Some accused critics of alarmism. Others warned against reading intent where none had been declared. But intent is rarely written into contracts. Outcomes are. Across social media and talk shows, an Ibrahim Traoré reaction emerged that was less about the individual and more about recognition. People recognized the pattern. They had seen it before, under different flags, different languages, different eras. Infrastructure first, dependency second, influence last. At this point, it is worth pausing. If you want to go deeper into these patterns, beyond what can fit into a single public video, there is a way to support this work directly. Members of this channel help keep long-form analysis alive, independent, and unfiltered by trending narratives. Membership is not about access to secrets. It is about sustaining patience in a world that rewards speed over understanding. Because patience is what this moment demands. As scrutiny intensified, so did the constraints. Governments operate within limited windows. Markets react faster than electorates. Media cycles compress nuance into headlines. Leaders face choices not between good and bad, but between bad and worse. Do you reopen negotiations and risk investor confidence? Do you proceed and accept long-term exposure? Do you diversify partners, knowing diversification itself takes time and leverage? None of these options are cost-free. What makes the situation particularly complex is that no single actor controls the outcome. Port authorities answer to ministries. Ministries answer to fiscal realities. Fiscal realities answer to global conditions. At every layer, agency exists, but it is bounded. This is how pressure works in the modern system. It does not coerce overtly. It constrains subtly. The Caribbean's challenge is amplified by scale. Smaller economies have less room to absorb shocks. One delayed shipment can ripple through prices. One policy misstep can trigger capital flight. Prudence becomes indistinguishable from caution. Caution from paralysis. Meanwhile, external actors can afford patience. They operate on timelines measured in decades. Contracts outlive administrations. Infrastructure outlives rhetoric. This asymmetry shapes behavior long before any crisis emerges. And yet, history shows that moments like this can still bend. Not through confrontation, but through coordination. Transparency, regional dialogue, shared standards, collective bargaining. When smaller actors align, leverage redistributes. That possibility, however fragile, is what unsettles established patterns. Because once questions turn into frameworks, and frameworks into policy, the quiet game becomes visible, and visibility changes incentives. The real turning point is not a speech or a headline. It is the instant when silence stops being the default response, when citizens expect explanations, when agreements are debated, not just announced, when infrastructure is discussed as destiny, not just development. That instant has arrived. But arrival does not guarantee direction. In the next chapter, attention shifts from systems to individuals, from structures to the people navigating them, their motives, their limits, the personal cost of standing between competing forces. Because systems exert pressure, people absorb it, and not everyone emerges unchanged. Systems do not feel pressure. People do. Behind every agreement, every concession, every clause written in careful legal language, there are individuals making decisions under constraint. They carry the weight of expectations from above and consequences from below. They are praised when outcomes look positive and blamed when hidden costs surface years later. This is the human layer often missing from discussions about ports, contracts, and geopolitics. Leadership in such moments is rarely dramatic. It is quiet, procedural, and relentless. It involves meetings where no cameras are present, documents thicker than speeches, and trade-offs that cannot be explained in a single sentence. It also involves knowing that whatever choice is made, someone will accuse you of selling out, while someone else will accuse you of recklessness. The price of standing in the middle is isolation. For smaller nations, this isolation is amplified. External partners arrive with teams of lawyers, economists, and consultants. Domestic institutions, by comparison, operate with thinner margins. Expertise exists, but it is stretched. Time is limited. Leverage is uneven. This is where pressure becomes personal. Officials tasked with overseeing strategic assets must balance immediate needs against future risks. Ports must function today. Ships cannot wait for philosophical debates. Workers need wages. Revenues must flow. And yet, decisions taken to keep the system moving can quietly narrow tomorrow's options. This narrowing is rarely intentional. It is structural. The individual at the center of such decisions becomes a conduit through which global forces pass. Their name appears on documents. Their signature anchors commitments that extend far beyond their term. History remembers the signature, not the circumstances. That is the unseen cost of stewardship. At the same time, external narratives simplify complexity. Commentary reduces layered realities to binaries: for or against, development or decline, cooperation or resistance. These frames travel faster than nuance, but they distort more than they clarify. What gets lost is the recognition that sovereignty is not a switch that flips off or on. It is a spectrum. It expands and contracts with each negotiation, each standard adopted, each dependency accepted. Midway through this conversation, let us pause together. Wherever you are watching from right now, take a moment to say hello in the comments. Tell us your country, your city, or simply the corner of the world you are listening from. From all of us here at the African Change, we send you respect and strength. This dialogue matters because it belongs to everyone touched by these systems, not just those who manage them. As scrutiny grows, so does resistance to scrutiny. Not because there is something to hide, but because transparency introduces unpredictability. Once citizens engage, outcomes can no longer be fully managed. Questions multiply. Demands follow. Timelines stretch. For those inside the system, This can feel destabilizing. For those outside, it feels overdue. This tension defines the current moment. Some leaders respond by retreating into technical language. Others open limited consultations. A few attempt genuine recalibration, only to discover how constrained their room for maneuver has become. Each response reveals something about the underlying balance of power. And then there is the personal toll. Long hours, constant negotiation, the awareness that mistakes will be amplified while successes are normalized. The knowledge that stepping back may be interpreted as weakness, while pushing forward invites backlash. Standing still is not an option. This is the reality of governance in an interconnected world. The margin for error shrinks as systems integrate. Decisions that once affected ports now affect data flows, supply chains, and diplomatic relations simultaneously. The cost of standing, therefore, is not just political. It is psychological. Yet history also shows that moments of constraint can produce moments of clarity. When options narrow, priorities sharpen. When pressure mounts, values are tested. The question now is whether clarity will translate into course correction, or whether momentum will carry systems forward unchanged until adjustment becomes impossible. Because infrastructure, once embedded, resists reversal. Not legally impossible, but economically painful. The longer arrangements persist, the more they shape expectations, behaviors, and dependencies. This is the weight carried by those at the center. Not villains, not saviors, just people navigating structures larger than themselves. And as this weight accumulates, something shifts. The conversation moves beyond who signed what, and toward who benefits, who bears risk, and who gets to decide. In the next chapter, the focus widens again, from individuals back to societies, from management to meaning, from pressure to possibility. Because when enough people begin asking the same question, systems respond. Slowly, reluctantly, but inevitably. And the question now rising is not about ports alone. It is about what kind of future is being constructed, quietly, beneath the language of progress. Anger arrives first, not the loud kind, but the quiet burn that settles when people realize how much was decided without them. It surfaces in questions whispered at dinner tables, in radio call-ins, in conversations that begin with, "Did you know?" It is the anger of recognition, of patterns seen too late, because once the machinery is visible, it is impossible to pretend it does not exist. That anger soon gives way to something heavier. Regret. Not for a single decision, but for the accumulation of small silences that made larger outcomes inevitable. Regret for the moments when transparency felt inconvenient, when scrutiny was deferred, when complexity was mistaken for inevitability. Regret is slower than anger. It lingers. Yet regret alone cannot carry a society forward. If it did, history would be a straight line of apologies instead of a series of corrections. This is where hope enters, not as optimism, but as responsibility. Hope begins with naming reality clearly. Ports are not just infrastructure. They are leverage. They are choices made concrete. They are promises to future generations about who will decide, who will benefit, and who will adapt. Hope also begins with understanding that engagement with the world is not surrender. Partnerships need not erode dignity. Development need not trade sovereignty for speed. But these outcomes require vigilance, not faith. They require publics that ask questions before crises force them to. They require leaders willing to explain constraints honestly, rather than hiding behind technical language. They require regional conversations that replace isolation with coordination. Most of all, They require memory. The Caribbean, Africa, and much of the global South have paid dearly for forgetting how power travels. It rarely arrives in uniform. It comes in contracts, standards, systems, and timelines that outlast the news cycle. This is why moments of clarity matter, why pauses in momentum matter, why reflection matters even when ships keep moving and markets stay calm. Before we reach the final words, let us slow down together. If this story has held your attention, if it has challenged you without telling you what to think, consider why that matters. Share this conversation not as a warning, but as an invitation to look closer, to listen longer, and to participate more fully in decisions that shape collective futures. Supporting thoughtful dialogue is not passive. It is an act of care. It is how societies learn to correct course before correction becomes crisis. Because the future is not built only by those who sign agreements. It is shaped by those who notice patterns early enough to influence them. As this chapter closes, the image that remains is not one of confrontation, but of crossroads. A road splitting under soft light. One path familiar, paved by precedent. The other uncertain, requiring patience, coordination, and courage. Neither path is free of cost, but only one preserves the ability to choose again tomorrow. This is why the story that began with ports does not end with them. It ends with people, with communities deciding whether complexity is something to avoid or something to engage, with regions rediscovering the value of collective voice in a world that rewards fragmentation. The lesson is not that influence is everywhere. It is that awareness still matters, and this is where the circle closes. What many recognized as an Ibrahim Traoré moment was never about spectacle. It was about timing, about naming a pattern at the moment it could still be examined. What followed, across continents and conversations, was an Ibrahim Traoré reaction not of uniform agreement, but of shared recognition. Recognition is where agency begins. If this moment becomes a footnote, momentum will carry systems forward unchanged. If it becomes a reference point, something shifts. Not overnight, not dramatically, but steadily. And steady change, guided by memory and attention, is how sovereignty is rebuilt in the modern world. So the final question is not who controls the ports, or who signed which document. The question is whether societies choose to stay awake. Because staying awake is the first step toward shaping the future rather than inheriting it. And that, more than any agreement, determines what comes next.